Welcome back to Ask the Educator, a podcast for all professionals involved in medical device processing and sponsored by Healthmark Industries. The education team here at Healthmark has 280 years of combined experience in areas ranging from sterile processing, endoscopy, OR, biomed, to hospital and industry leadership. Our goal is to leverage our collective experience to answer one of your questions each episode, giving you the practical tips you need to succeed in the evolving world of device processing. My name is Kevin Anderson, clinical educator here at Healthmark, and I will be your host. Let's get started. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Ask the Educator, our podcast here at Healthmark. With me today, I have Stephen Kovach. Remember, we're doing a series on the 10 factors of cleaning. Today, we're doing a third one out of the 10. We're going to be talking about training. But Stephen, before we get started, I know you had a question come in that we'd like to clarify before we get going again on this one.
Yeah, it is. And it was a really simple, basic question. And it said, Steve, are these factors, is this really the steps in the cleaning process? And I got a hold of the person who says, no, your steps of the cleaning process, pre-soaking and manual automated, and more or less the life of the instrument or whatever you're doing, because then it goes to assembly, inspection, and so on. This is our critical factors of cleaning or factors of cleaning that impact why you have a dirty instrument in that part of the process of the cleaning aspect, whether it's pre-cleaning or manual cleaning. If you get that dirty instrument, you have to inspect why, and that's why we're talking about these critical factors, and they dovetail into that section of the life of an instrument or whatever when you have a problem. So if I cause some confusion with that, to our listeners, thank you. That's what we love. We love feedback. And with that, Kevin, I know you and I sort of in the last podcast, you sort of leave these factors up to me, and we were sort of talking about, again, IFU and a little bit of training. So I'd like to do the one on training, or what we call human factors, if we could, for the next few minutes here. Does that sound okay with you, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I wanted to thank you just for clearing that up. Any of us in sterile processing or in the operating room, we're confronted with, suspicious things that we find in our OR trays and things like that. And that's really why we wanted to do this series on the 10 factors, is just try to help people, really figure out what the potential problems are.
Yeah. That could be, that's the other thing I like. It's sort of like we're sitting down at work or something over a cup of coffee. That could be a whole nother podcast on what do you do when you find a dirty instrument in the OR, you've been thinking about that, but we'll let that one go for later and move along with this human factors or training. And as a supervisor, manager, director, you've got to make sure your staff has the right tools to do things, and they have to know how to use them. And the best example I always think of when it comes to training is you might have got your automated washer working correctly, or your sonic, and you tested and all these other things are working. And I talk to a manager and they say, let's go into decontam. I go in and I see somebody loading an orthopedic tray with the lid still on it. And right away, it's going, that is a training issue. So I hope for the people who are listening can start thinking of those types of training issues or human factors in their department, because here the person needed to open the lid, needed to take those different trays out, because in the IFU on the majority of the orthopedic trays, they will say that the container is just a holder during sterilization, and those levels must be pulled out and separated. So if you keep it all together and closed, the detergent and the rinse and everything doesn't get there. And that is a training issue. I hope I didn't bring up a nightmare for you, Kevin, but I'm sure as a manager, you've got similar things. Was there any that I sparked in your mind quickly here?
Well, number one, yeah, it does remind me of just a very common problem, but I'm glad that you brought up not only training, but human factors as a whole, because I think sometimes that issue is training. And I think sometimes it's also the human factor of wanting to rush and get things done. Because say a vendor tray comes in and people look at it and they think, well, it's already been cleaned. I can just throw this in the washer and move on with my day to the other instruments that are clearly much more dirty, and
Yeah.
without taking the tray apart and all that stuff. So it's all under that human factors umbrella. That was a decision made by a human in the interest of saving time or whatever, but it was clearly the wrong thing to do. So, but there's also that point where the new person may not know, maybe that got overlooked in their training for some reason. It didn't happen. So we need to make sure as managers or supervisors or even just peers on the other side of the washer, if you see that come through, that should be a red flag to you, right? You're going to obviously see that container come with all the levels intact and possibly even a lid on it. I mean, that should be a huge red flag. Whether that thing was used in your facility or not, doesn't matter. It should be a red flag to the trained eye, and we need to make sure that that our staff are identifying that. And secondly, another thing that came up in my mind is just those modular instruments that we brought up in the last episode.
Yeah.
We had a brand new modular laparoscopic instrument. It was 3 pieces, and we were using it in our laparoscopic trays. And we had a call from the OR one day, and they called me up and said, "Hey, what am I supposed to do with this instrument? It doesn't work." And the reason it didn't work was because it wasn't adequately put together, not to the point where it was actually where the jaws would open when you move the thing, and then the insert would fall out. So I had to literally find out who it was. It was somebody on our midnight shift, of course, that probably didn't get the adequate training, in all honesty. So I literally had to come in on that shift and physically watch her put this thing together, train her, number one, and then watch her put it together to the point where she felt comfortable putting that thing together. So those are the 2 things that really come to mind when we talk about training. I'm sure there's loads of other examples and things that come, to our listeners' minds as well. But very important factor.
Yeah. What I wanted to also share with you, and we do work for HealthMark and, so on. But a lot of times when both of us or all of us are called in, it's to do a cleaning audit. And what I like to do is I like to use our TOSI, the test object surgical instrument, on the orthopedic trays. And I don't think I've ever showed you some of the pictures I've taken, but I've actually put a TOSI on the top, on the outer layer, and on these multiple layers, put one on each layer and ran it through. And of course, the one on the top usually gets completely clean unless there's some other things going on. And then as we open the lid and we go down, most of the time they're barely even cleaned. And there's a lot of hemoglobin and everything else. And that is showing the staff the importance of pulling those levels out and separating them, because now they're actually seeing that this isn't getting clean, going through the little holes or whatever. And so now you're able to use it as a teachable moment and go from there. So this education and training's going on. There's some others that in this topic, what they try to do is they also try to put in certification. And I think that's also something that gets into this human factors and training. I believe whether it's mandated in every state or whatever, we really should have certification as a minimum qualification. And I always think of Tony Monaco in New Jersey and a friend of ours, Ann Cofield and Nancy Chobin, how hard they worked to get that through New Jersey, the first state with certification over 10 years ago. But I just wanted to sort of close that up with human factors, education, training, all go in there. And I think certification is an important part of it. So when you're talking with your staff, they have a basic level of what you're talking and what's needed, Kevin. So I know we did this pretty quickly, but I think we got the point across with our two examples, and hopefully people understand how important human factors education and training is. And it is one of the factors that play into why an instrument isn't clean and functional, and you gave it a great example of it and what you had to do. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the education and certification part because, as a nurse, I had to go through a college education in order to actually function as a nurse. And that's one thing that's missing in sterile processing that I believe is critically important. And we should be holding our departments to that standard, whether it's required or not. Getting that certification really should be the baseline entry point. An assistant level or something like that, I think is a great idea. And we're not quite where we need to be yet. And I recognize that. But for those of us managing and administrating over sterile processing departments, we really need to make that our entry level point,
Well, I hope we created some thoughts out there for people, and maybe they won't have nightmares tonight thinking of some things like you just thought of in this conversation. But we've given people something to talk about, the importance of training and education and the human factors when it comes to making sure their instruments are clean and functional. So again, Kevin, I think we hit the major points on this, and I want to thank you again for that. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Stephen, for joining me. Again, to everybody out there listening, please, if you think of a factor that we don't touch on throughout this series, please feel free to reach out to us, send us any information at asktheeducator@hmark.com. We'd love to hear from you, even comments, or you can share any sort of training stories or whatever else you want. We'd love to hear from you. But thanks for listening. And thank you again, Stephen, for joining me.
You're welcome. Bye, Kevin.
All right, everyone. I want to quickly recap this episode. We were talking about each of the 10 factors of cleaning in our 10-part series. And in sterile processing, you're going to have to try and solve the mystery of dirty instruments at some point. So in this episode, Stephen and I discussed the human factor. The human factor includes things like training and competency, and even circumstances that could be work-related, could be home-related. We're not robots, right? We can't pretend that we aren't emotional beings and that our emotions don't affect our work. Also, we're not computers. You can't just download the latest IFU and start automatically processing the instrument correctly. Human factors are always something to investigate when you're trying to solve a dirty instrument problem. I hope you're enjoying the series here on the 10 factors of cleaning. Please check out all of our episodes and leave us a rating and review. Thank you all again for listening. All opinions expressed on this show are those of the presenters. Before using any medical device, it is important to review the device manufacturer's instructions for use.